Hi everyone, and welcome to our webinar on how to bring your frontline workers into the digital workplace. Today we're joined by LiveTiles CTO Patrick Püntener and Clearbox's Director Sam Marshall. I'll let them introduce themselves in just a minute here, but first some housekeeping. As you can see, feel free to post your comments in the chat section. Along with any questions that you have, we will address those at the end. Slides and the recording will be shared after the webinar via email. Don't hesitate to reach out to us with any questions whatsoever at any point. And we will also be posting a few polls throughout the session today. So any feedback you can give would be great as well. And now over to you, Patrick.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Patrick Püntener. I'm the CTO at LiveTiles. I'm happy to present this webinar on how to bring communications to frontline workers. And with me, I have Sam Marshall. Sam, maybe you introduce yourself.
I will, Patrick, and I've done it before, yes. So hi, thanks for inviting me to join this LiveTiles webinar. So I'm Sam Marshall. I'm the director of Clearbox, and we're a boutique consultancy based in the UK focusing on digital workplace strategy.
So first, a quick look at the agenda. I will open the webinar and set the scene by looking a little bit at the challenges that companies have if they want to include frontline workers in their communications, but also the opportunities. Then Sam will talk about mobile use cases and content from the frontline, and I will give you some examples of how we can engage frontline workers by using employee apps. And finally, we will also have a little discussion between Sam and me about tools. There are a lot of tools around, from Yammer to Teams to tons of employee apps pouring into the market. And of course, the big question is what to use when. And in the end, we are open to questions and answer them. So let me talk a little bit about challenges when communicating to frontline workers. Yeah, if you are a company with a global workforce, you probably have a lot of people also working from remotely, and amongst them you will have a lot of non-desk workers. And we think if you look at their needs of information, it's quite different from desk workers who have a laptop and sitting at the desk the whole day, working on the laptop with the information the whole day. And you have a series of challenges with these kind of workers. First of all, they have different devices, so they have smaller screens, and sometimes they also have very little time to consume information. And it might also be that they're working in environments that are not very friendly with regards to transmitting information. For example, they could have a bad connection. They might not even have their own device, but have to share the device with someone else. And there's also a challenge in implementing tools and technology that can really cope with this, and at the same time is capable of providing relevant information so that people are not overwhelmed with information. And also, if you communicate, you will have to deal with a lot of different languages and cultures between these people. The frontline workers are probably coming from abroad, maybe they're contractors or they work in different countries if you have a global workforce. And you also have seasonal and temporary contracts, so you have a lot of fluctuation in your workforce, and that's quite difficult to cope with. Last but not least, people on the front line often are quite remote from leadership in the company. And it might seem to them that the leadership team is sitting in an ivory tower and just communicating very top down. And we know that many leaders in large corporations are also looking how to become more transparent, more open to the whole base of employees. And I think employee apps also offer an opportunity for the leadership to communicate in a much more agile and open way. I'm handing over to Sam, who will go a little bit more in detail about these challenges and opportunities now.
Great, thank you, Patrick. Yeah, so, I mean, if we look at where we're at the moment, there's quite a few surveys out there saying that frontline workers are significantly more disconnected than our office or white collar workers. So there's this state of the Deskless Workplace 2020 survey done by Quinix, which basically said the deskless remote workers don't feel that loved by their employers. So the grey circles representing different sectors, generally around 35% of people saying that they don't feel valued by their employer. And that's a worrying amount. I mean, I know employee engagement is a problem in many sectors, but this is particularly high. And to me, it matters because frontline workers have particularly distinct value to bring to an organization. And I would say there's three big categories of this. First of all it's normally the frontline workers who get the customer feedback, first of all. So say, for example, you launch a new product line in retail or a new food substance if you're in restaurants, like a new recipe. They're the ones that are going to tell you, first of all, if it's working or not. And maybe sometimes you can make some quick changes based on that feedback. But if you're cut off from the frontline workers or they don't feel motivated because they don't feel appreciated, you're not going to get that kind of feedback. Secondly, there's a lot around process improvement. So often in labor-heavy industries, most of your costs are coming from the productivity of people. And usually the people who are implementing those processes that will detect the inefficiencies, but they're not always empowered to make changes to those processes. Often there are operating procedures that they've got to follow. And so often they can give ideas to their boss and their boss will pass it on to someone else, but a little bit diluted, and no actual change happens. There's a really nice example from Heathrow Airport a couple of years ago, where one of the security guys, you go through the bag scanner and they ask you to open your bag and have a look and all that kind of stuff. One of the security guys realized that they were doing a lot using paper-based forms, and he was a bit of a frustrated programmer, so he taught himself the Microsoft Power Platform and started developing Power Apps that he then shared with his colleagues, also on security, saying, for example, here's one that will translate your request to, can you open your bag, madam, into Hindi. If you were someone who doesn't speak English, you can put this into the Power App and hold up your phone and they can understand the instruction. So that's really powerful if you can get the people who are using the processes to also make those optimizations. And the third value that particularly we should focus on for frontline workers is around product performance. So, it's very easy in research and development, in product development, to come up with a nice shiny new product that works great within the lab. But often the reason why customers become disenchanted with our brand is 6 months, a year, maybe even 2 years down the line, where things start to go wrong with the product. Or maybe there are ways in which they've adapted the product to do new things that could give you an idea about other product lines. And it's people like our engineers, our repair and servicemen who go out and see what these products look like when they're no longer new and shiny, but have actually been through some real world usage. Another interesting study that I recommend is a report called Remotely Interested by Jenny Field and Benjamin Ellis, done last year. So they worked in 7 different organizations and interviewed about 300 frontline workers. And they were particularly interested in their feelings about internal communications. And just to zoom in on 3 of the statistics from this infographic, frontline workers do not feel overloaded with information. There's a common misconception that we shouldn't be telling frontline workers loads of stuff or sending them loads of information because it will distract them from getting on with their job. But in the remotely interested studies, they found that only 3% of employees said that they had too much information about their organization, department, or industry. People want to know where they fit in and know that they make a contribution. And often the channels that are used are very traditional. Most cases, people would say, the information I get comes from my team leader or from my manager. But only 36% of remote workers believed that their manager was an accurate source. There's a big gap of trust. They want to feel like they are getting the same version of the truth as everybody else. And if it's coming through their manager as a source, there's a little bit of filtering going on, maybe a little bit of spin that they don't really want. So that means that even for these frontline workers who might not be that digitally connected, the intranet and the company website is still the main channel for information about their organization over and above their line manager. And that means to me that we need to serve up these channels really well. Traditionally, we might have used notice boards and print magazines, and they do have a role, but they tend not to be updated very regularly. And let's face it, they're not at all interactive. That last slide I was saying about all this great feedback you could get, you don't get feedback by someone pinning up another notice on the notice board and hoping that senior management walk by and see what they've commented. And if they have commented, it's probably rude and will get censored anyway. So there are definitely digital barriers to doing this, but also I hope I've convinced you that it's worthwhile. I think one of the fundamental barriers is no longer that they don't have a digital device because everybody has personal phones. The next barrier is actually, well, how do we get these people onto an experience which is secure and owned by the company? And there's a kind of catch-22 in that if you don't have, for example, an email address, then it's really hard to send them that link to say, how do you log on? And Patrick, I know this is something that you've been thinking about. Tell us what you've been doing at LiveTiles.
Yeah, actually, this is one side of the challenge. One is the content, and one is enrolling users, how to get them onto such a platform. Maybe I can make some examples of how you can do this. If, for example, you don't have an email address of a user because the user doesn't have an organizational email account or doesn't even have a user account at all. He might also not have a device from the organization, but only a private device. And solutions go into a direction that you, for example, use other means to communicate that there is a system a frontline worker can use. So you could really go back to very traditional means of just handing out a paper to a person, maybe a paper containing either a link or maybe a QR code. That's better because if you have a modern smartphone, you can scan the QR code and don't have to bother with entering the link and maybe misspell something. So a QR code on paper or a QR code that is displayed on a kiosk screen in a factory hall, for example. Or I know actually companies who send the QR code home with the salary slip in an envelope that the employee certainly will open. So that's one way. Sam, you're laughing. Why?
I just think to myself that the salary slip is the one bit of mail that everybody opens.
Yeah, exactly. But really, sometimes it's the only interaction HR or corporate comms can have with an employee who is all day long on a construction site or just far away from the office. And maybe other means are, of course, if you have a phone number of a person, maybe you have a private phone number, then you can use this phone number to SMS or WhatsApp the link to the app, for example, or you can just maybe also publish it on your website. Since you need some kind of identification, I don't see this as a problem because people who don't have an ID that can be used to log in later on will not be able to use the link. So you can just publish it on your website in an area and tell people, go to the website, there's the link. But then there's a second aspect. If the employee does not have a corporate email address, he needs some other means of identification. And you see here some examples of what our app is capable of doing. You can, for example, give people an organization ID that they can enter and that only they know. And the organization ID will, of course, not be just a number, but it will consist of several items whereof one is a shared secret that really just the employee and you can know, and where you can make sure that people who log in through this way are really those who they pretend to be. Of course, you can use private email addresses if this is appropriate, or also a private mobile number can be used to identify and authenticate. In this case, there are several ways to do this. You can, for example, enable a self-registration process that also takes away the burden of managing all these users, because maybe you have tens of thousands of frontline workers and you don't want to manage a directory for them centrally. You don't have it actually. And with our approach, people can manage their account themselves. So they will be asked the first time they're logging in that they enter their first name, last name, and define a password and create an account. And then it's up to the organization whether they want to verify the account or whether they want to use things like whitelisting to make sure that people who log in are really the right people.
All right,
So there are
that's
many
great.
ways,
Yeah.
ways of doing it.
Yes.
But you have to be quite innovative, and sometimes it's tricky. Yeah.
And I was smiling to myself, about you could share it with WhatsApp, or in the US, SMS groups are quite popular. And part of me was like, oh, but that doesn't sound very secure. But I think the reality is lots of frontline workers are using things like WhatsApp. They're using consumer grade communication tools because they don't have anything that's at a corporate level provided to them to that communication. So in a way, it's you go to where they're already working, and then you help them step out of it into an environment which is more suitable for work type discussions.
Exactly. Yeah. But you might also have discussions like, are you allowed as an organization to tell your employees to use a private device, for example? And then you're a completely different level. And I think that's depending on what country you're working in, what the laws are, and so on. Maybe also what you give people if they agree to use the private device. Maybe you pay them a little bit for using them.
Yeah, and maybe at the end we can talk about payments and costs associated with private devices, because that definitely comes up a lot in the work that we do.
Yeah.
But for the moment, I want to talk about some of those mobile use cases. In the consumer world, a few years ago, Google put it very succinctly. It said basically the three situations in which you would use a mobile like a smartphone, which is repetitive. So maybe you're monitoring. You might be waiting, for example, for a bus to come or a parcel to arrive. You're bored, you've got a bit of downtime, you're in a queue waiting for coffee and you just want to kill some time. And urgent, which is maybe you're out and about, you've arranged to meet someone and you can't quite find the cafe where you said it would be, so you pop up a map and you try and get directions. In each use case, people are expecting really quite different things from the mobile phone and the apps on it to solve those problems. And I liked the simplicity of what Google did. So I tried to say, well, within a mobile digital workplace, what are the kind of 5 approaches that we should be thinking of? And one is that a mobile can be used as a second screen. So even, for example, if you are a desk worker, it's not uncommon for people to have the mobile phone in front of them, and, for example, use it to look at Teams and see if any messages are coming up in Teams, or use it to check a calendar while they've got their email open responding to someone asking about availability. Second one is using downtime, so that is the board scenarios. So, again, no one probably at 9 o'clock in the morning fires up their laptop and thinks, great, I've got a big screen, the first thing I'm going to do is read corporate news. But if they're sat in a meeting and they're waiting for a couple of minutes for a colleague who's running late, then yes, you probably will want to use corporate news at that point. The third one is away from desk. Of course, with frontline workers, they don't have a desk, they're always away from it. But even if you're office-based, in a large office, you might be, for example, looking for a meeting room and have that urgent scenario where you say, can't remember exactly which meeting room it was. I know it's on the 3rd floor. I need to remind myself. The fourth one is where I think mobile apps get really interesting, because mobiles have extra sensors that are rarely true of desktop. So cameras, GPS, accelerometers, all of these things that can be used to augment the way in which people work. And the last one is when mobile is the only option. So there are certainly people in roles where they just can't carry a big laptop, or maybe they are on a retail shop floor and it's not appropriate for them to have a big screen intruding between them and the customer. So they would use, for example, a mobile phone only during quiet moments. So recently, Clearbox did a report where we looked into the employee app market, of which LiveTiles Reach is one of the products that we featured. And we tried to summarize what are the ways in which apps can change the working life of frontline employees. So, for example, away from desk on the left, we've got a construction worker who may never see the company offices, but they rely on the app as a touch point to understand what's the company doing, what are the success stories, maybe new partnerships or contracts that have been won. And then if we think about the gardener, the next person along on the street, For them, a lot of the time, they won't be able to reference what jobs they have to do, but they might have a task list as part of the app saying, during the week, these are some of the jobs to get done. And then shop workers might use some of their downtime as a learning opportunity. Of course, they can't sit down for an hour and go through a massive e-learning module. But employee apps can be a way to, for example, put up quick reference cards or maybe do a 3-minute quiz, which is a great way to top up their knowledge. If, for example, they work in technology retail, there's always new things changing, new product lines that they need to become familiar with before customers come in and ask about them. And then look at the guy on the moped. So a moped delivery driver may, for example, be required by his company to report near-miss incidents, because health and safety isn't just something to do in workplaces where you control it, but if you're out and about, health and safety is still the responsibility of the employer. You can have an app where people report a near miss, and it uses sensors like the GPS to automatically tag that report with the location. And lastly, our bus driver, they need an app that has a do not disturb facility, because in that last case where the mobile is your only option for digital communications as an employee, it might also be their personal phone. And we can't have work intruding on their lives when they're on break time, at the weekends. And indeed, if they're an hourly employee, there might be serious kind of financial implications for asking someone to read a corporate message when they're not on the clock, because really you should be paying them for anything that's work related. I just wanted to show another example about the sensors one as well. And this is courtesy of Kobe, which is a Danish architecture and construction consultancy. So Kobe build big things like bridges and so on, and they have specialists that will go and inspect the construction and make sure it's working well. So they developed a custom app to help people do this, which is called Field Notes. And the idea is that, you know, some of these people are literally dangling from pieces of rope halfway down a bridge that could be 50 meters off the ground and taking photographs of concrete. And they use the mobile app as a way to capture those photographs, but also they do some quite clever things. So of course, again, you can tag the photograph with the GPS location, so there's no need to note down where it is. You can also, for example, geotag documents and say, well, these are the plans that apply specifically to this construction site. So using the physical location as a filter on all the documents that you might have in the system. And normally what happens is that the engineer will type a few notes about their observations, and then when they get back to the office, that's when their phone becomes a second screen. And I think the really clever thing that Kobe had done is that they then sync the app with a customization of SharePoint that takes all of those notes and shoots them into a Word document, which is ready set up with a template for the photographs and the notes to go in there. And also the metadata on the document is tagged with things like the location and the project name and so on. So it's a really good continuity from things that are necessary and useful when you're out and about with a small device through to things that are best done when you do have a keyboard and big screen in front of you. One of the other things about that Google setup was monitoring. And to me, maybe what we're lacking at the moment in terms of supporting frontline workers is the equivalent of a lock screen for work. So this is the lock screen from my iPad. As you can see, I've got loads of notifications coming up from SMS and Twitter and Skype and Quora, which I spend far too much time on just reading interesting answers. But in a normal kind of day, what this does is I pick up my iPad and I get a sense of what do I actually need to attend to? What are the important, urgent things that have happened since I last looked at my screen? We don't really have something on a mobile device that aggregates all the notifications that are relevant to us in a work context. And I think it's really helpful if we start to think about what are the different signals coming from across the organization and how we could aggregate those into a single feed that people can make decisions on. But on the urgent front, you know, there are some messages that organizations need to get out, and I'm going to invite Patrick again to tell us a little bit about what LiveTiles is doing there.
Yeah, we have used our own app internally to inform our employees during the first lockdown we had here in Switzerland during COVID. And we have a special feature that allows us to send out alerts. You can see the little red triangle and the red box. That is an alert that always sticks on top in the app. When you open the app and read your news, for example, you will always see alerts on top. And we can also shoot a push notification to the lock screen. And that is very useful to inform employees about important things that are just happening that they need to know. So for example, we could alert people on Sunday not to come in the office on Monday because there were new recommendations from our government that you should stay home if you can. Otherwise, people would have needed to come in to the office just to hear that they should go home again, for example. And we were also constantly updating this alert because there were coming new and new recommendations, maybe every other week from the government. Also about social distancing, all the stuff that everybody knows today. But back in time, it was all new for people, and it was very well received that we had such a simple way to reach everyone and with immediate effect in such a situation. We see this also in a lot of other contexts with customers who maybe have to warn people from weather hazards or from accidents that happened close to where they work, or also to, for example, just send a risk profile about their environment to show them what they need to pay attention to.
Excellent, thank you, Patrick. So far what we've talked about has tended to be signals coming from the organization down to the employee. But also I think digital gives us a massive opportunity for us to receive content from the front line and understand some of their stories. And I just wanted to share some examples with you about how that might look. One of our clients is a utility company called Essex Water based in the UK. And what they wanted to do was get a better sense of what work looks like for most of their employees, because the people in the office, you know, they process bills and so on, but it wasn't really what the water company was about. So they set up a space where employees could start telling and sharing their stories, and that included photographs and sometimes videos of what they were doing. And there were big discussions about using paper cups or banning paper cups as part of their environmental policy. There was big discussions about the gender pay gap and so on. But one of the greatest hits was about fatbergs. Now, forgive me if you're not familiar with this delightful topic, but fatbergs accumulate in sewers when people pour fat down their kitchen sinks, and it gets cold and it gradually builds up, and some of these can be like several meters high. And of course, they block the sewers, and the Essex Water guys valiantly have to go down there and chip it all out and collect it all. So they published this story on their intranet so employees could see it, and everybody really liked the fact that they could not only see the story, but actually it was such great news that it was on the local TV as well, and then on national TV. And employees felt really connected because they could say to their families, oh yes, I know about the fatberg story, and they could fill it in. It wasn't like the employees were hearing it for the first time. Second example comes from Selfridges, which is a retail department store, chain of department stores in the UK. So they, for their frontline workers, they chose Yammer back in 2018. It had very good, strong adoption. But one of the things that I really liked is that customer service is really important to Selfridges. And traditionally, it would have been head office would tell employees what good customer service looked like. But Selfridges turned it on their head. They said, okay, employees, you're the ones doing this. When you see an example of great customer service, you share that with us. So employees, you tell us what customer service looks like. And then every month, the managing director would pick an example and they would amplify it as a customer story highlight. And I think that's a great way, not just of learning from the front line, but also celebrating what they do. Another thing that happened at Selfridges was they had a doorman, and he set up an internal blog just called Nick the Doorman. And often doormen, they don't really get noticed. You know, you walk through into the shop, you walk out again, and someone's normally there holding the door and greeting you, but you know, it's just like a transient thing. But doormen see a lot. They're always watching what's going on. And Nick the doorman was a really good guy at writing up and sharing with other employees what it was he was seeing. And it became such an internal celebrity that when Selfridges refurbished one of their stores and did a grand reopening, the celebrity guest to open it was Nick the doorman. And everybody in the branch was like, oh, great, we're going to meet Nick finally. It gives people a sense of connectedness with the organization that is otherwise missing when the only world you're exposed to is the one in your physical space. And the last example is about giving feedback. So British Airways ordered a new fleet of the Airbus A380, and the engineering team in Wales started sharing the designs of what the cabin was going to look like internally. And the cabin crew were really excited about this because it was the first time that actually they'd had a chance to see what was coming when it was still in the design stage. And some of the cabin crew looked at the kitchen design, the galley, and went, you know what, that's not really going to be optimal for us. We really should have the hot stuff above the cold stuff, and pretty much sketched out on a napkin a better layout, photographed it, and shared it back with the engineering team in Wales. And the great thing was that this short-circuited the normal kind of feedback loops where the cabin crew might have fed back to the boss and it gone to the boss's boss, and it could have taken weeks or even probably never for that feedback to go back to engineering. And what that would have meant was that the changes would only have been, would have come too late, and they would have rolled out the galley in a suboptimal way. This is a really powerful way to get feedback again from people who are going to be using your product, the galley design, and actually make sure that their views are factored in, and kind of give them a sense of control and a sense of being a stakeholder in the work that they're doing for you. So there's just 3 examples. I'm sure that there's loads more, and it's really good to think about what are those stories that you might have heard verbally or anecdotally inside your own organization, and say, do we really share those enough with everybody that would be interested in what happens in our frontline? And Patrick, you're going to tell us now about engaging frontline workers.
Yes, Sam. I really liked your examples, and it shows that you have so many different possibilities to use modern technology. And of course, one important aspect is really that you manage to engage your employees, because otherwise even the best technology is not of big help if it just causes distraction or information that is not really needed, or if it's just a burden to workers to use it. So first of all, I think if you want to have an engaging solution, you have to look at the industry you're working in, because not all industries have the same needs and the same use cases. As you have seen, I think also in your examples, it's so different of what you could do, and that's really specific to what people actually are working with. All I can say is that employee apps, so the tools that can be provided, they usually provide value in any industry. You just have to find the right use cases. Of course, there are generic applications like providing news or providing a channel to post stuff to gather feedback from employees. But there are also more specific ones that are very interesting because they create real value and are not just communication. I mean, communication is probably the fundamental thing in all these examples we have just seen, because without communication, nobody would know about these things and nothing would happen. But there are also other things you can do. And we have also worked with a lot of our customers on very specific use cases. Of course, the obvious one is the one this webinar is about. First and foremost is how can employee apps help you to better connect with these frontline workers, to better communicate. But also there are other use cases that are quite similar. For example, if you look at the typical intranet use case, it might be that if you are a company who has, for example, a big part of frontline workers and only a small part of desk workers, that this approach to use such an app is much more efficient than to build a big intranet, a traditional intranet that is complex, requiring a lot of project work, and the same information that you actually need could also be transmitted through a simple app. So we have customers who have done that with the same technology than the employee app. They rolled out the entire intranet, but you could call it maybe pocket intranet. So it's not as comprehensive as a complete SharePoint intranet, for example. Then you could also look at distinct departments who have a special need for communication, like for example HR. Maybe they want to use such a tool just for themselves, just for their communication, to also make a distinction between the overall communication tools like the intranet and their specific tools they're using to better reach the people. Another one is extranets. I think you have a lot of situations where you actually, it's not good enough if you only reach your employees, but you also have to reach your contractors, maybe your partners, maybe you have a franchising model, maybe you have an agency model. You need to reach your agencies with almost the same information than your internal employees need to do their work. You could also extend this even to customers and just inform customers about things in a similar way, because I think it's also for them, you have the same benefits if you have an engaging app, if it's easy to access the information, if you can define yourself as a user, what you're interested in, and so on. All the benefits of an app over, for example, a boring newsletter that it disappears in your mailbox can also be a very interesting use case. And then finally, we also discovered that if you go beyond normal companies and maybe even also government organizations to member communities like sports clubs or unions, or you could also say religious communities. So all the organizations who have loosely coupled, not employees, but users and an audience that is maybe not centrally managed like in a company, they have a lot of benefits of such an app, because they can actually manage their members, manage their audience much better in such an app than instead of having to set up a huge infrastructure to manage them, for example, on Active Directory. And there's a lot of self-service that they can provide to these people by employing an app concept. I would like to go through the most important features our app has and see them in the light of how can they be used to engage users. So it will not be just a feature demo to show you how this works, because I think it's quite self-explaining, but rather how can you use news, posts, people, events, and pages, the major modules our app has, to engage people, and what use cases are typically used or implemented by our customers. So let's start with news. I think the news part is a clear way to enable companies to inform and also warn their employees, because the news could also be an alert, just a different format, for example. And we think what is important here, if this should work, first of all, you need an engaging experience for your authors. So those people who actually need to create news and publish them, they need a simple way, a simple interface to do that. So they need tools that give them the possibility to create a news in minutes and to publish it in a controlled way. Because otherwise there will be no content available for the users, and without content, no user adoption and no interest in the app. I think that's pretty clear. On the other hand, you also need to provide relevant content. So on the user side, you need to be able to manage what you're interested in, to select, for example, like here in the form of channels that can be on various topics, or in an organization could also be by location, by department, and so on. And we have built a way to combine top-down and bottom-up needs in the communication. So you can have mandatory channels that the user cannot opt out from. You don't see them here because he cannot opt out. And suggestions that the user gets when he logs in the first time, and then he can simply say, I'm not interested in HR, not interested in academy, for example. I don't want to pin success stories on my menu, but I want to get the news, or I don't want to have push notifications for News Switzerland, but still get the news in my overview. And with a few simple clicks, as you can see, the user can generate a profile for himself that makes sense to him. What is also interesting is that we can not only manage content that lives in the app, but also link to external content. Like, for example, here, looks like a news, but is actually just a link to a news article in a newspaper. Or like here, looks like a news, but if I open it, it opens a SharePoint page with a SharePoint news that has been published in your intranet that now only also is available in the app for your frontline who don't want to bother with opening first a website, then log in cumbersomely, and then need to know where SharePoint news are in your intranet. With a simple click, they can just open it. Then in posts, that's also a typical way of fostering, let's say, engagement and bottom-up communications. News is more or less top-down. Of course, you have possibilities to give feedback, but posts are, as you can see, is very similar from the format as what you know from Yammer. So you have a thread with a post, and then you can engage a conversation. And also here, it's very important what you use it for. We have seen applications like, for example, groups for expert support, where you have experts that are listening to this thread and giving answers, and people can ask questions. You can use it as an idea box where employees can post ideas, other employees can discuss them, management can look at them. And if you don't want to employ a big idea management system, that's a very good way to listen to your frontline. I mentioned leadership communication on my first slide. One way of doing it is establishing a CEO chat where the CEO or the leadership team is posting stuff, or you can ask questions and they answer it. Or you can also use it for knowledge exchange by just providing channels that turn around a specific topic where people can exchange their experiences. So I think with a simple mechanism and technology-wise, a tool that is easy to use, you can cover a lot of use cases that can create engagement and connecting people. Another way of delivering content is pages. Pages are different from the rest of the content that you just saw because they're structured. So you have cases like, for example, manuals, documentation, training with embedded videos, or just documentation of knowledge that can live here. And with a simple navigation, you can browse through content because you have a hierarchy here, and you can open up a page very easily also on a mobile phone. And for example, just jump to a training video that is directly embedded in the page, combined with text, images, and other content. This helps users to access information quickly. We have one client who has, for example, digitized the whole technical manuals that their employees who work in facility management use. They had to carry with them booklets, printed booklets before, with technical documentation to know how to operate the various equipments they had to maintain. Now they have this app, and they have a whole section of technical documentation with embedded explanatory videos, amongst others, to show them what to do. And the beauty of it is also that this is always up to date, because you can also, of course, edit a page easily as an author and then update it, and employees will get it immediately that there is an update and can have a quick look on what has changed. The last section is events, or the last content type that we support. And of course, this is really useful to connect people. Since we are able to provide or to promote both online and on-site event, even with multiple locations, so you can, as an event author, you can enter several locations here, even with a number of seats that you can specify, and you can select between physical sites and online meetings. Then there's a full registration process that you can enable, even with questions that you can ask, like, where will you attend? Do you need a parking lot? Do you need a hotel room? Or maybe are you a vegetarian? Then I think this is a very useful functionality to be used in multiple ways for internal trainings, for certifications people have to take from time to time, and of course for all company and staff events and activities that you want to plan and you want to communicate. There is also a people directory in the demo environment. That's not so interesting to show because there are very few users in this environment. But interesting about the directory is, since you are also able to enroll people from outside your company and people whom you usually don't find so easily in your other systems, this is a great tool for an internal phone book that also contains information about contractors, partners, or even customers. And maybe as an outlook, we are working on a new module called Vibe, and this will be a good tool to capture also the pulse of your organization by capturing sentiment that will be easily integrated here as well, and can then be used to capture this information and feedback from your employees as well. So this was my little overview. And let's go to the next, and I think last topic, Sam.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. And really good to see that. Maybe that segues nicely into what to use when. So always when people say to us at Clearbox, you know, when will we need a dedicated employee app and we've already got an intranet, or do we need one alongside Teams? There's lots of different factors, but I think what I noticed most about LiveTiles Reach is the simplicity of it compared to like a traditional desktop-oriented intranet. So I would always say one of the things to think about is how much complexity is appropriate for the audience that you're addressing. And typically, frontline workers, they want something which is really stripped back because of the things that I was talking about earlier about them maybe only having 2 or 3 minutes to look at things, or if it's a learning opportunity, they're not going to have the time to do lots of different modules. So even just from an interface design point of view, reducing it down to something which has a very obvious affordance, in the sense that what your options are really clear, and that you can complete something which is satisfying in a short time, is important. To me, it's a kind of a sliding scale where if you start out with an intranet and try and shrink it down, you probably compromise on that objective. Whereas if you start out from something very simple, which thinks about the mobile use case first and scale up, you probably will compromise in terms of what's great for someone with a 32-inch or 27-inch monitor, but maybe less so than the compromises coming the other way. And Patrick,
Yeah.
what do you say to people who say, well, we've already got Teams and that's got a nice mobile experience?
Yeah, I think what you just said is very important. And just as an example, before I go into your question, I showed you pages. We have customers, they create pages, and the page is just actually a navigation element that links to a SharePoint page. And they do that because the SharePoint structure that they have in their intranet is far too complex for their frontline, because they don't know anything about these things. They just need access to certain pages in the whole structure, and they do a restructuring in the employee app that is suited for first-line workers, that is simplified, that actually just contains the pages they need, regardless of where they are. And it's a very straightforward and simple way to provide these pages, and that's because the solution is very well integrated with the whole Office 365 platform. And I think integration is also an important topic, because you're right, you need more than just the employee app if you look at the whole organization. And what to use when is then, of course, also a question of who should use what and not only when, because maybe the frontline worker uses a different tool to access the same information than the desk worker, like the employee app and the intranet. But I think it's also depending on the information flow, and that's what we usually apply first to when we need to decide what tool is most suited to fulfill a certain need. And basically, there are typically two kind of information flow that are completely different, and that makes it also quite easy to decide whether a tool is suited or not, because most tools are built for just one kind of information flow. And if you look at this picture here, you see on the left side the typical use case of an employee app like LiveTiles Reach. It could also be the typical use case of an intranet, just in another form. But that's when you have clearly defined communicators who want to reach a big part of the entire company, and the flow is directional. So it's an information that comes from these communicators, goes to the audience, and of course there's maybe a feedback getting back to the communicators. But it's always the same. They're communicating, they're getting something back. So typical use cases are news, for example, updates and corporate events that need to be communicated. So things that need to be communicated, policies and procedures, and so on. On the other hand, you have the conversational flow that you typically see in collaborative scenarios. And that's a typical use case for Teams, for example, or other collaborative tools. And where Teams is good at is really to enable people to directly communicate with each other. So it's like the conversations in Teams are a substitute for WhatsApp, for example. And I think most companies would love it to see people not using WhatsApp, but Teams for the conversations. And that's also a strong tendency to use Teams for this. But as you can see from the pictures, the flow is completely different. There's no clear communicator. There's no clear direction. And also, the number of teams is far more elevated than the number of target groups in the other case, and it's dynamic because you have new teams all the time, whereas the audiences are quite static in the directional case. So that's maybe the most important thing. Maybe you have other topics that you think are important, because I think there are some.
Yeah, I mean, just on this point, I'm reminded of recently. I was looking for the official artwork for Facebook, like their official logo. And if you think of Facebook as a platform, it's very conversational, isn't it?
Yeah.
And there's actually nowhere in the Facebook model that fits the delivery of reference material like what is our official logo. Facebook actually hosts this on a WordPress site, which just goes to show, you hit natural limits of what you can do on one format, and then you really do need to switch to another one. It's the same with Microsoft Teams versus the role of something like an employee app, where you're actually, people want that authoritative voice. As we learned earlier, they don't want everything coming from their line manager, because there are issues of trust and indeed timeliness to it. The other thing I would say about the simplicity angle is targeting becomes really important when you're short of screen space and you're short of time. We can't rely on like the internet paradigm of having mega menus where you browse through the mega menu to find what you want. We need to take more of the burden of work onto the information supplier to say who really needs to see this, and put it into a simpler format, which might be like a time-based flow, where a lot more of the things that matter are also transient and urgent, rather than necessarily something that you would go and search for by browsing through and seeing what the options are.
Yeah, exactly. And that is also leading to a point I encounter often, that targeting is also related to whether you have a target audience or not. Because I think in the case of Teams or in this conversational flow, there is no real audience. It's just all self-organized. There's nobody who is really taking care of how things are communicated. Whereas in official, I'd call it official or managed communications, you have an audience. It's a very clear audience, and that's also where you can target, and you also have to target. And maybe a third point is also the type of content. You just mentioned this example of Facebook. I think if it's structured content that needs to be managed, it's also a completely different case than if you have discussions or threads going on, like in Teams, about a very specific topic that is constantly changing, maybe. And it's quite easy, because most of the applications you see are either or. They cover one case, and they do that case very well. And if you try to implement the other case with the same tool, you will probably fail.
Yeah. So I see Jamie's popped up a poll for people to reply to, and maybe that's a hint that we should pick up a couple of questions that have come in. So everybody, please answer the poll.
One thing to say, and I was mentioning integration, and what is really useful is when people are using a tool for their daily work, and a lot of people are using Teams all day long nowadays. If you can reach them with this other communication, the official communication in the tool they're using, and that's why we are also providing a Teams app that is integrating this communication that comes from the company to the tool that most people use.
Yeah, very good. Jamie, what questions have we got?
Yeah, hey guys. So we did get one question that came in a little bit earlier. You touched on it a little bit, but maybe you could just expand on your thoughts. The question is, would you say to be successful and not to undermine the company's intranet investment, the mobile app needs to be directly tied to the intranet? I see numerous third-party communications tools, but wonder if they dilute the intranet news that's happening in two places, etc.
So I don't think there's anything particularly protective we should be about the internet. So undermining the internet, I'm not precious about that, but I do think from a communicator's point of view, it's desirable to be able to create the content in one place and then push it out to numerous channels. But we need to get away from the internet as a destination and see it more as a channel which suits particular work styles, but not every work style. Patrick,
I fully
anything
agree.
to add to that?
Yeah. I just wanted to mention I fully agree with this. From a communicator's perspective, you might want to reach different target groups, and some are using the intranet, some have just the mobile phone, some are using Teams, and some are using nothing of this. So yes, you need a tool, an authoring tool, where you can manage your content and then decide what channels you want to use to reach what target group. And the internet is just one of them.
Yeah, great. And I think you can always come up with a brand that covers all of these channels. You know, whether you call it the hub or insight, you can brand all these different components so it doesn't feel like you're competing, but they're just the right tool for the job.
Excellent. Yeah, that is all the questions we have for today. And just to remind everyone, we will be sending the recording and the slide deck following this session. So we will also provide some email addresses where you can reach our presenters if you have any further questions.
Awesome. Well, thank you everybody for tuning in from me. It's been a great pleasure to join LiveTiles on this.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. It was a pleasure to discuss and do this webinar with you. Thanks.
Same here. Thanks. Goodbye.